It's terrific to be back in Brisbane. Brisbane is where I grew up. I went to Oxley High School. My father worked at Forex. And I'm looking forward tremendously to the dinner tomorrow night, not only because it's the conference dinner, because I can see where my father worked. He never took me there. It's very hard, I think, to begin directly after the experience of hearing Bruce talk and the kind of welcome that we had. Long before I heard that, I wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land here, and to say something that we all know, all of us who've grown up in Australia know, that obviously the Aboriginal peoples are people of great spirituality and have a kind of orientation to art and to poetry that is so much more vast than the rest of us. If you want to know those of you who haven't grown up in Australia, some of the truly great Australian writing, you go to the song cycles of the Aboriginals. And the other thing I want to say, because I'm working on contemplatio at the moment, especially for the Gifford lectures, is that of course I've learned a great deal about contemplatio in my own tradition, in Christianity and especially in Catholicism, but I've also learned an enormous amount from the Aboriginals that I've met over my time in Australia. And I was reminded of this when Bruce kept asterisking how slow it is to paint his works and the kind of patience one needs to create art. And that is all part of what we call contemplation. Now I'm going to be talking about, mostly I'm going to be talking about an American poet, A.R.Ammons. And one of the reasons I chose A.R.Ammons for a conference called Talking Slantwise from Emily Dickinson is that he has a very strong connection with the American landscape and with our native inhabitants of it, which doesn't come across immediately in what I say, but I think you'll see that it's there slantwise. In early 1942, the French Algerian writer Max Paul Fouché devoted a special double number of his revue Fontaine to an unusual theme, de la poésie comme exercice spirituel. His readers would certainly record Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises in the 16th century, a serried set of meditations designed to lead Catholics on retreat to discern the will of God in their lives, and thereby to attend to him first and foremost. Holding a copy of the review in their hands, potential readers in Algiers or Paris might well have wondered how poetry could in any way resemble the meditations and prayers that Ignatius had composed, and the effects that they could have on them. In some respects, Ignatius bypasses the tradition of contemplatio and consolidates meditatio. His pages are profoundly and densely committed to images of the life of Christ and to the practice of finding God everywhere. But could one expect poetry to do anything remotely similar to meditations on hell, the Passion, or the resurrection, events that bear on one's eternal soul? Over the 30 days of the long retreat, people undertaking the exercises seek spiritual integration under the guidance of an experienced retreat leader. Yet most poetry, it will be said, does not require non-natural beliefs of any kind. And while it may broaden one's consciousness or sympathy, usually it does not aim to change one's life decisively in any particular respect. When the review was reprinted in 1978, a new literary generation might not have been quite as puzzled. Like those who came before them, these later readers might have thought of Rimbaud, especially the Voyant of Les Illuminations, and they would also have remembered the Surrealists, especially André Breton, who sought contact through writing, including automatic writing, with whatever might be beyond the mundane realm. Yet some people might also have recorded books that could not have been known in 1942. Among them, Georges Bataille's L'Expérience antérieure of 43, with its longing to trespass over the line separating life and death, and Maurice Blanchot's La Patte du Feu of 1949, with its commendation, and I quote, of literature as experience, which makes fun of art and is ready to ruin itself to attain the inaccessible. They might also have thought of Blanchot's more recent claim, made in the aftermath of May 1968, that the very act of writing could dissolve the I, regarded as a centre of power, opening it to a new way in which human beings could be in relation with one another, deferred, mobile, plural, and dispersed. To think of poetry as a spiritual exercise for the contributors to Fontaine was to recognise that some mystics have had recourse to poetry in order to express their ecstatic states, and equally that some poets, including atheists, have used poetry to press beyond conventional or even natural limits. It was to do with either transcendence or transgression. Just 3 years after the reprint of the special double number of Fontaine, a book whose title chimed with that of the special number appeared, Pierre Hadot's Spiritual Exercises and Ancient Philosophy of 1981. Yet there's a gulf between the journal and the book. Hadot does not affirm transcendence in any Christian sense, it eschews transgression. Rather, he places a welcome emphasis on ancient philosophy, philosophia, not only as a discourse about logic, ethics, physics, and metaphysics, but also as a call to bring one's life into conformity with what was being learned in those areas. One might well see that Platonists, Epicureans, and Stoics, among others, sought a transformation of the self by practicing highly coded methods of attending to it, by way of dialogue, overflight, physical definition, premeditation, attention to the present moment, and so on, instead of merely intellectually mastering a doctrine, and that monastic Christians would come to do the same. Here, it might be thought, is something that does not fit into the theme of poetry as a spiritual exercise. After all, the pagan exercises, like the Christian ones that adapted them, adhere to strict models, while poetry, especially in the modern age, craves originality. Poetry is seeking transcendence or performing acts of transgression, in one or another sense of those two fecund nouns, has long been a theme of romanticism and much that's come in its wake. Instead of pursuing it here, I wish to dwell with the spiritual exercises identified by Hadot and place them within the frame of the title of the special double issue of Fontaine. One might think, first of all, of specific poems that could be spiritual exercises. Lyrics by St. John of the Cross, Hafez, Ephraim the Syrian, for example. They're deeply spiritual, but it's less than clear that the writing of them would close any gap between what each man believes and how he lives. A better example might be George Herbert's The Temple, if only because we have Herbert's last note to Nicholas Ferrer, in which he says that his friend will find there, and I quote, a picture of the many spiritual conflicts that have passed betwixt God and my soul before I could subject mine to the will of Jesus, my Master. With the final line of the concluding poem of the collection, namely Love 3, we presumably see complete accord between Herbert and Christ in that wonderful image of the Eucharist. Yet Herbert's word picture might give us pause. Perhaps any spiritual exercises occurred outside the realm of writing poetry, and the poetry simply, or not so simply, represents what happened. The temple would not be a set of exercises so much as reports of them. What though if we exclude devotional poetry, and even poetry that is openly religious, in order to see what spiritual exercise might mean more broadly with respect to poetry? In doing so, we would remain closer to the French spirituel rather than the English spiritual. Now, several caveats must be registered right at the start, beginning with the expression spiritual exercise when it's been detached from Loyola and loosened from the Greco-Roman practices that were taken up into Christianity and redirected there. We must be careful to put out of play any affinities that the English word spiritual has with cultural or emotional refinement, yet to preserve reference to thought, even the intellect, but not to the exclusion of the imagination, memory, and sensibility. The word exercise also needs preliminary attention. I'm not interested here in a poet trying out a set form, such as a pantoum or triolet, or submitting to a series of severe constraints, as one finds promoted by Oulipo, in order to catch the muse off guard, as it were. I wish to preserve, for the sake of my investigation, the sense of exercise as enabling an improvement or modification of the self in one way or another. That said, I keep this word as open as possible for the time being, if only because it may well be that there are elements of some spiritual exercises, or maybe ghosts would be a better word, at work in poetry that has no strong or overt relationship with philosophy or religion in any robust sense of either word. In order to be able to return from my exploration, I will attend only to one modern poet, although there may be others who would repay a reading with the lens of spiritual exercise placed an inch or two over their books. I've chosen A.R.Ammons for a variety of reasons. First, his religiosity is neither institutional nor heavily marked. Indeed, one would not be wrong to label him, perhaps a little crudely, as an agnostic or even an atheist, not least of all because of the ways in which the study of the natural sciences has marked him. He is our most Lucretian of poets. Second, many of his most memorable lyrics, as well as many that are not, seem to be partly characterized by what some of the ancients called spiritual exercises. It's doubtful that he knew directly of their use in Greco-Roman culture, though who can say for sure? More likely, he gathered something of them by way of his study of Taoism, or perhaps he absorbed them passively from Western culture at large. And third, the poet speaks himself of poetry by way of self-transformation. His work is too copious and too varied to be covered in a single essay, especially one with a highly restricted aim. It's also very uneven in quality, although that's not a pressing problem here. My motive in entertaining the idea of poetry as spiritual exercise is not intended to be a covert means of commendation. It may be simply that thinking of some of Ammons's poems in terms of spiritual exercise, and I'll be mentioning only a few of them, brings facets of them to light that might otherwise not be noted. So I'll be cutting only a thin line through a broad and diverse work, not mentioning many of his most engaging poems. Finally, I must draw attention to an ambiguity in what I propose, for we may think of writing poetry as a spiritual exercise, and just as cogently we may think of reading poetry in that manner. The former might be legible in some poems, although there's no special reason why it should be, unless it's marked by a specific lexical form of spiritual exercise, in a dialogue, say. Also, to use poetry in the service of something else, even if it's taken to be a good, is always to render it secondary. And this is a danger implicit in a writer's choice to figure his or her writing as a spiritual exercise, one that might well prompt all traces of the surface to be erased. Only a poem remains once an exercise is complete, regardless of whether or not the writing of it has had the desired effect on the poet. One might be left with a weak poem or a strong poem, a finished poem or something far rougher, after having completed an exercise. And that exercise might have been successful or unsuccessful. With regard to reading poems as spiritual exercises, it must be allowed that people read poems for a wide range of reasons: consolation, enjoyment, distraction, instruction, wisdom, and so on. But that the central ground in play here would be the quest for insight into how to live one's life. I will keep the ambiguity between reading and writing alive throughout, although my accent will fall a little more heavily for longer on the writer rather than the reader. Ammons begins what would be a long and prolific writing life with a Martian with Doxology, 1955. One striking feature of which are apparent exchanges, if that's not too strong a noun, since sometimes they are little more than separate ejaculations. There is the poet adopting and adapting the mask of Ezra, a hunchback boy recalled from childhood, and elements of a desert landscape about him that give the name a biblical resonance. The first lyric of the collected poems in two inexorably thick volumes, entitled "So I Said I Am Ezra," narrates a failed communication. Neither the wind nor the sea answers the poet's proclamation of bardic or prophetic power. His name, Ezra, falls out of being, as he says, by dint of mere repetition, and he's left to wander in a landscape that evades memory. Thereafter, his attempts at interchange are somewhat more successful. In the second lyric, "The sap is gone out of the trees," an oat field cries out, "Oh!" in acknowledgement of the barrenness of the landscape, and is seconded by the wheat fields. But it is only when the wind adds its voice to theirs, saying, "How shall I, coming from these fields, water the fields of earth?" that the poet answers. He does so by exclaiming, "Oh!" and falling into the dust, much as the oats and wheat have done. Soon the poet separates himself, as he says, from every natural heart, and only with the sixth poem does dialogue appear as a structural feature. He addresses the sun and then the moon, and each responds to him. He begins to chastise the sun, source of life, for its anger at the moon, which prettifies the world at night, since, as he says, all at last must be lost to the great vacuity. Thereafter one finds more ejaculations, but no more dialogue. An exercise, however, seems to have been completed. Inner dialogue, along with the adoption of a long perspective, has led to the recognition of a natural law that is at odds with human desire. The inner dialogue, as I'm sure you all know, is an invention of Augustine's. I remember the cartoons about having a bad angel and a good angel on the shoulder. That's pretty much a visual translation of Augustine in the Confessions. By the time Ammons writes Hymn, 1956, he's concerned less with evoking a law of nature than with determining its ground, which he addresses as though it were a person, something no Stoic or Epicurean would do. He says, "I know if I find you, I will have to leave the earth, imagining his steady ascent until he reaches the unseasonable, undifferentiated, empty stark. No sooner has he passed as far as he can in this direction, though, than he realizes, and I quote, "If I find you, I will have to stay with the earth, for the principle of nature is to be found here equally, right on down, where the eye sees only traces." Although this sounds like a hymn to God seen solely through the aperture of natural theology, there is not the slightest sense of transcendence in play, let alone any personal attribute. If anything, Ammons goes a step too far in making the point, which comes across as more than a little awkward, where he talks about praying for a nerve cell with all the soul of my chemical reactions. It's as though he concretizes just a little bit too much. Rather, hymn is about the poet finding his place in the great scheme of things, somewhere between the two extremes of nature, at the level of a sweet gum that has begun to ooze sap at the cut. It's a poem about accommodating oneself to the immanence of the natural world, a secular hymn of awe and of setting aside all hubris. Now, you should all have a handout, is that right?
Peter's just gone to get it.
He's gone to get it. Well, maybe I should do a little dance until we wait. Something. It's okay, I'll slow down a tad. Another early poem that figures nature as law is Gravelly Run of 1958, one of Ammons' lyric triumphs in his first maturity. The poem's theme is the sufficient, as is announced right at the start, and as it happens, at the very beginning of the collected poems, where Ammons speaks of being about to embark on the track of the sufficient, which henceforth asterisks in advance the poem under consideration. Now, this is actually going to be on your handout, but I might as well read it now. You can hear it and then read it, which is not a bad thing. Yeah. I don't know. Somehow it seems sufficient to see and hear whatever coming and going is, losing the self to the victory of stones and trees, of bending sandpit lakes, crescent round groves of dwarf pine. For it is not so much to know the self as to know it as it is known by galaxy and cedar cone, as if birth had never found it and death could never end it. In a colloquial offhand manner, the speaker says that he's learned to accept the primacy of the objective world over against his subjectivity, the effort in doing so lightly suggested by the words "as if." All that he brings under his gaze resists him. The air's glass jail seals each thing in its entity. If he says that it's no use to make any philosophies here, it will assuredly not be any theory that diminishes the claim of nature or suborns it to a supposedly higher mode of being. As he says, Hegel is not the winter yellow in the pines. All that can be said is that the self is surrendered to unwelcoming forms. So perhaps Epictetus or Lao Tzu is there, if not Hegel. There is nothing for you or me to do here or anywhere in terms of enhancing or deepening our subjective aperture to the world. The lyric ends, "Stranger, hoist your burdens, get on down the road." And as we hear those words, we understand ourselves to be less strangers in Ammons' world than strangers in the world about us. We know that things will be no different down the road. Namely, there's a law in nature that we have to conform to. And this is exactly what the Stoics in their spiritual exercises are enjoining themselves to do, which Christians took over. This theme of the recalcitrance of nature, as so many instances of phenomena subject to a fixed law, continues throughout Ammons' work. If we look ahead to a poem of 1970, Staking Claim, we find dialogue once more. This time he is talking to a line of willows without getting any salute at all. The trees, he says, never would waken, never could feel the rushing days. Yet their lack of awareness of his presence underlines his consciousness of time and perhaps helps to reconcile him to the long changes to which he, and everyone human, is subject. Later in Ballad, 1973, he develops a fuller dialogue with the same willows, finding them self-absorbed to the point of selfishness, eager to get rid of the water oak that takes some of their resources. The poem ends with the possibility, by no means assured, that the willows can settle their differences with the water oak by presenting it with, as Ammons says, our powerful concept that all things are in all. In truth, it's the poet's concept, not one shared by the willows. But what's important is the way the dialogue has the potential to overcome selfishness and pointless dissent, and to bring the various natural beings into harmony with an evident law of natural life. So he's extended in many ways the Stoic spiritual exercise. It's not just bringing oneself into conformity with nature. Here it's the willows who have to be brought into conformity with nature so they don't take away the rights of the other plants in the area. The role that dialogue plays in a spiritual exercise is most clearly seen, though, in the poet's encounters with mountains, which seem impervious to change only because from a human perspective they're transformed so very slowly. We remember Mark 11:23 and Matthew 21:21, where Jesus imagines someone with faith telling a mountain to throw itself into the sea. Maybe you've tried this more successfully than I have. And we remember St. John of the Cross evoking Mount Carmel as the spiritual peak that Christians must climb in the darkness of unknowing. Ammons cuts a quite different figure in the same ground. There is no room for faith in his view of things, and no wish to dispose of any mountain. Perhaps Emerson's Fable, his poem about a squirrel and a mountain having a quarrel, is in the background. But if so, it's no distraction. More though, for him, mountains are beings of another time, or better, are as close to eternity as there can be in this world. They serve as sages whose steady contemplations over the ages merit deep respect and that invite a contemplative stance in those who ponder them. Consider, for example, Continuing of 1975, which begins with the poet inspecting the soil for the accumulation of 50 seasons, fallen leaves in progressive states of decay. On reaching the lowest perceptible level of sand or rock soil already mixed with the meal or grist, the poet initiates a conversation with a nearby mountain. Now, this is what you've got. This is the quotation that begins, "Is this, I said to the mountain." So you should all have that somewhere. Thank you. "Is this, I said to the mountain, what becomes of things? Well, the mountain said, one mourns the dead, but who can mourn those the dead mourned? Back away they sift in a tearless place. But, I said, it's so quick, don't you think? Quick. Most time, the mountain said, lies in the thinnest layer. Who could bear to hear of it? I scooped up the sand which flowed away, all but a cone in the palm. The mountain said, it will do for another year. Now, such is the voice of Ammons once he's in stride, modern, American, and just a little folksy. Yet the motivating thought behind the dialogue is ancient and ultimately Stoic. The daily exercise of reducing one's anxiety over death and decay by bringing oneself into harmony with nature, that is, law, which is achieved by attending to changes in the landscape. I think of Lao Tzu advising us to realize that all things change, or Marcus Aurelius telling himself the universe is change, and more plangently, how all things quickly vanish, our bodies themselves lost in the physical world, the memories of them lost in time. The Bible is even more insistent on this wisdom. All flesh is grass, and all the goodness thereof is as the flower of the field. The nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. Isaiah 46. In the same year, 1975, Ammons talks with another mountain, this time passing from his own apparent inconsequence in the cosmos to a consequence that he believes he truly embodies. Apologetics begins with the speaker telling the mountain that he doesn't amount to a thing, that he comes from nothing and will return there, and that he has no summit from which to view the world. The mountain replies to him, addressing him as Sir, very polite mountain, and says, what you don't have, you nearly acquire in the telling. There is a weaving, winding around in you, lifting up buzzard-like in you, high windings. To which the speaker responds amusingly, just a minute, exaggeration is not your prerogative. You have to settle for size. Eminence is mine. No poet, the mountain cannot outlast the ages except by virtue of its sheer bulk. Its wisdom is deflated. And so what begins as a spiritual exercise swerves away from being one, and the poet wryly defends his supposed status as standing on the peak of Mount Parnassus by way of the word exaggeration, which suggests comic self-regard on the one hand and self-deprecation on the other. A similar self-mocking could be found in another dialogue, this time with a river. This poem is slighter than those discussed so far, but it exhibits a charm not always noticed when reading Ammons. It's entitled Dominion, a word that immediately recalls Genesis 1:26, where God says that men will have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth over the earth. And this is in your handout too. This is the whole poem. Glittery river, I said, rise. But it didn't. Stop them, damn it. But it didn't. Oh, river, I said, ruffle blurring, wind knots up. And that was nice, like perch striking royals at surface flies. River, I said, don't turn back. And it eased on by, majestic in the sweetest command. One might associate spiritual exercise as practiced by the ancients, or even a modern such as Wittgenstein, with self-therapy, but not by way of humour. To affirm how to live and what to believe was no joking matter for the ancients, or for any philosopher in their wake. Dominion lightly reflects this tradition, as well as the tradition spawned by Genesis 1:26. It relaunches Henry of Huntington's story in the Historia Anglorum of 1154, which you probably remember, of King Canute demonstrating the power of God to his courtiers. I remember being told this when I was about 5 years old. I commend you then, not to flow over my land. This is King Canute addressing the sea. I command you then, not to flow over my land, nor to presume to wet the feet and the robe of your lord. Canute addresses the sea in those terms. And when the tide continues to come in, he says, let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, for there is none worthy of the name, but he whom heaven, earth, and sea obey by eternal laws. The powerlessness of the human before the inexorable forces of nature in dominion is rendered comic precisely by the empty-vatic commands with which the poem starts, and the risible lack of connection between the final injunction and the river's action. Only when one respects the law of nature does the order work, as it were, precisely by not working at all. Being brought back to the claim of nature upon us is achieved in another dialogue with a stream, Away of 1975. Here the poet confesses his fantasies to a stream, his fantasy of wind that unwinds freely and of late snow on warm rocks, only to have those reveries deflated by the stream that, bending around a rock as it goes along, calls out by way of rebuke to the poet, "Dream of rock, rock!" It's a lesson that Ammons had already learnt. We can trace its lineaments in Corson's Inlet of 1962, among other fine poems of the period. Here the exercise is the simplest possible, a walk by the shore to clear one's mind, which involves tuning mind to its reasonable possibilities and excluding those that are beyond its powers. As he says, but overall is beyond me, is the sum of these events I cannot draw, the ledger I cannot keep, the accounting beyond the account. In seeing the variety of life along the shore and the many ways in which nature organizes itself, the speaker accepts what is given precisely as it is given. He says, I have reached no conclusions, have erected no boundaries, shutting out and shutting in, separating inside from outside. To align oneself with the evident laws of nature, its patterns of order and wider forces, to attend closely to the present moment, is finally liberating. And this is how the poem ends, which you have before you. I will try to fasten into order enlarging grasps of disorder, widening scope, but enjoying the freedom that scope eludes my grasp, that there is no finality of vision, that I have perceived nothing completely, that tomorrow a new walk is a new walk. Or as we're told in Saliences, another haunting poem about a coastal walk, where not a single thing endures, the overall reassures, and one is temporarily placed beyond concern for the separate reach. A quite different spiritual exercise occurs in one of Ammons' most memorable lyrics, Cascadilla Falls of 1966, another poem in which a stream is central and which I quote in full, which you have before you. I went down by Cascadilla Falls this evening, the stream below the falls, and picked up a hand-side stone, kidney shape, testicular, and thought all its motions into it. The 100-mile-per-hour earth spin, the 190 million mile yearly displacement around the sun, the overriding grand whole of the galaxy with the 30,000 mile per hour of where the sun's going. Thought all the interweaving motions into myself, dropped the stone to dead rest. The stream from other motions broke, rushing over it. Shelterless, I turned to the sky and stood still. Oh, I do not know where I am going, that I can live my life by this single creek. Here we have a modern version of the Stoic exercise of placing a person or an event in a cosmic perspective in order to reveal the inconsequence of human problems and to generate a sense of wonder instead, which is something I think we all do. You have a bad event and then you think, in 10 years' time, I won't even remember it. Same sort of thing, but on a much greater scale here. Again, consider one of Marcus Aurelius' notations to himself. If you were suddenly lifted up to a great height and could look down upon human activity and see all its variety, you would despise it, because your view would take in also the great surrounding host of spirits who populate the air and the sky, and that, however many times you were lifted up, you would see the same things, monotony and transience. Similar observations may be found in several of Seneca's letters, in Cicero, and in Lucian. Yet Ammons does not simply repeat a familiar cosmic spiritual exercise, one that Pierre Hadot nicely calls imaginative overflight, when you look down upon human events from above. First of all, Cascadilla-Falls does not turn on looking down on the little patch of earth where he lives and where people swarm around in futile activities. Nor does it despise anything at all. Alternately, in accord with modern physics, Ammons thinks all the movements to which the earth is subject into a single stone that he holds. Now, phenomenologically, as Husserl has admirably shown, human beings, even centuries after Copernicus, regard the earth, for all intents and purposes, as not moving at all. No one actually holds on to anything as we walk along, although we surely know that it is. So all the motions really need consciously to be thought into the stone. No sooner has the speaker perceived the stone from a cosmic perspective than he does exactly the same thing with himself, a movement that's been prepared for by figuring the stone in human terms. The stone is hand-sized, kidney-shaped, testicular. And having brought the astonishing speed of things quite home to himself, and numb with the thought of his insignificance in a cosmos without apparent aim or benevolence, he drops the stone into the nearby stream, which, following its own laws, just flows over it. Even if we know nothing about the physics of waves, we're likely to recall Heraclitus, you can't step into the same river twice, or Cratylus, you can't step into the same river once. Or perhaps Marcus Aurelius, existence is like a river in a ceaseless flow, its actions a constant succession of change. The stone, notice, is not merely at rest, it is at dead rest. The line between the inanimate and the animate is divided and equivocal when one gets to a long perspective. It's only after this recognition that the speaker turns to the sky, not looking down, as in the Stoic exercises, but looking up. The prompt to do so is the recognition that he is without shelter. There is nothing above him to protect him from harm. At the end of the exercise, it's not human negligibility that comes to console grief, deflate ambition, or ameliorate pain, but rather that in the absence of divinity, the speaker has no compass in life. Of course, since he plainly knows some cosmology, he knows just where he is going, physically, because he knows that the planet Earth orbits the Sun and that the solar system moves within the Milky Way, which itself passes through space at 515,000 miles an hour. What he does not know are the answers to the questions that the great catechist Clement of Alexandria posed, or more familiarly, that Paul Gauguin's catechism teacher imprinted upon his pupil's consciousness. Where does humanity come from? Where is it going to? How does humanity proceed? This is what Clement taught in Alexandria, and exactly Gauguin's catechism teacher told him. And of course, we know that those questions led to Gauguin's great canvas of 1897. Ammons's reflex to the sudden cosmic perspective to which he appeals is given in the present, a break with all that precedes it, which has been relegated to the past tense. His lament is that he does not know how to answer Clement's or Gauguin's tremendous question, Où allons-nous? Or better, where am I going? The consequence of that lack of knowledge, whether it's moral, metaphysical, or religious, impinges on the propriety of him living out his life by this single creek. It reminds him forcibly of the indifference of the cosmos and of its endless transformations with no overarching direction behind it, unless we consider the second law of thermodynamics, which is not especially consoling. That I can live my life comes to mean, in effect, how can I live my life given what I know about the cosmos? The speaker contemplates that in the grand scheme of things, he resembles a stone around which the cosmos pours for a short time. What might have been an exercise of consolation for a Stoic is, for Ammons, one that, in an equally Stoic spirit, prompts him to figure how best to live, which means being happy with little, living by a single creek. Ammons's most compelling long poem, Sphere, the Form of Emotion, of 1974, might at first also seem to invite being read in terms of overflight, for it's centred upon an image of the Earth as seen from the moon, perhaps that beautiful photograph commonly known as Blue Marble of 1972, which I'm sure we've all seen. We're told early in the poem, I could not say then that the earthworm is not my radical cousin, and I could not say that my veins entering along the cell walls disassemble the transportative leaf. But this is a minor sounding in a self-sustained poem of 1,860 lines. Also, one finds here the Stoic exercise of physical definition, whereby one presents someone or something solely in physical terms, without any subjective judgments about it that stimulate desire or fear. And one does so in order to reduce one's desire for it or one's fear of it coming to pass. A good example of this is the French writer Émile Cioran, who is sometimes so distasteful that he has a point in one of his books where there's a paragraph saying he was on a train going back to Paris and he was sitting opposite a very beautiful young girl. And he said in order to still his desire for her, he imagined her dead and her flesh rotting in the natural processes. I find this repugnant myself, but this is an extreme example of this kind of Stoic exercise. So one reads lines such as, beyond the autopsy and the worm, the blood cell, protein, amino acid, the nervous atom spins and shines unsmirched, the total necessary arrival, the final victory, utterly the total loss. and the sage reflection that comes by way of a jolt, a stanza break. We want to change without changing, out of change. More characteristic of Sphere is the resigned yet shrewd sentiment, and if we go separately but altogether to non-distinction, we might as well make as much distinction here as we can. The world of the poem is entirely free of the divine in any traditional sense. The Most High, who is invoked from time to time, being no more than the grounding principle of natural life. One has only to read the poem This Black Rich Country, with its stoic directive, presumably to himself, dispossess me of belief, to see Ammons's willed willingness to accept mortality. Much later in his book, with the wonderful title Bosh and Flapdoodle, wouldn't you love to have written a book with that title? Bosh and Flapdoodle. He reflects on his apparent naming of the deity in his poems. The following lines return us to him and touch on several other poems along the way. When I say you in my poems and appear to be addressing the Lord, I'm personifying the contours of the on high, the ways by which the world works, however hard to see. Indeed, the gods, who we're told in Sphere have gone, and who may return, are simply hardwired to how the human mind works. The concrete, the over-invested concrete, the symbol, the seedless radiance. Our proper response to life, he thinks, should be to accept our smallness, bend to cherish the greatness that rolls through our sharp days, that spends us on its measureless currents. The commendations run in the opposite direction to the lament at the end of Cascadilla Falls. And where the speaker of that lyric was anxious about the future, Sphere attends, as much as possible, to the present moment, a familiar spiritual exercise of Stoic and Epicurean alike, and of course a widespread practice in American poetry, beginning with Whitman. An image of a profile of the whole planet on which we live encourages Ammons once again to say everything he knows or does not know. Earlier in his writing life, he's presented himself, as he says, a posing man who must talk, but who has nothing to say, and has asked himself why always make something out of everything, a question he worries time and again, and has even observed to himself, I'll have to say everything. Sounds a bit like a threat sometimes. If one thinks of Ponge's The Glass of Water, or Perec's attempt to exhaust a place in Paris, which is his book where he tries to say everything about a block in Paris. It's a whole book just devoted to what happens moment by moment on this one block in Paris. So he's trying to say everything over a particular few hours that occurs in Paris. One should probably not let the thought lead one too far. There is nothing Frenchified in Ammons. It's not that he says, not that he so much says all that he knows or sees, as that he seeks to say what he does not know at the moment by way of fulfilling arbitrary requirements. He wrote his poems, for the most part, after the early 60s by taking artificial lengths of paper and putting them into his typewriter. One of them is written on adding machine tape, so that it gives him a line. And so he found that he couldn't write, just sit down, as probably the rest of us do, and write a poem or a story. He needed a really strange artificial requirement there to get the creative juices going. If we think of Novalis in his monologue, we shouldn't press the thought too far either. Yet in these relatively early remarks, one sees a crack opening to allow a distinction between writing a poem and writing poetry as a process that might delay any settling down into a poem. Between a relentless saying and a said, something to which in a part of the paper I won't read tonight, I would return. Especially in the latter part of Ammons's writing life, it is the daily practice of writing poetry, not necessarily poems, that marks his use of spiritual exercises. Namely, he cultivates the art of speaking to himself to reduce his own anxieties. Often enough for Ammons, this drive, as the French say, tout dire, to say everything, to say absolutely everything. This drive tout dire has organised itself by way of the one-many problem in philosophy, or even more generally, the centre-periphery figure. Although in sphere it's more true to say that the whole poem occupies a continuously moving centre. Nothing is relegated to the margin of his or her attention, since both gazes are pushed ever onward by a metre that thrusts downwards more forcefully than it does across the page. For all its many twists and turns, its ceaseless ascents from the everyday to the sublime, and its risky descents again, the poem concludes its survey of life, not with a lament, but with an affirmation trying valiantly to be more joyous than resigned. Now, this is on your handout too. This is the very end of the poem. To float free, the orb floats, a blue-green wonder, so to touch the structures as to free them into rafts that reveal the tide. Many rafts to ride, and the tides make a place to go. Let's go and regard the structures, the six-starred Easter lily, the beams feeling up the stakes. We're gliding. We are gliding. Ask the astronomer, if you don't believe it. But motion as a summary of time and space is gliding us. For a while we may ride such forces, then we must get off. But now this beats any amusement park by the shore. Our Ferris wheel, what a wheel! Our roller coaster, what mathematics of stoop and climb. Sew my name on a cap, we're clear, we're ourselves, we're sailing. The further one extends context far beyond the realm of the human, the more we can take in the sheer extent of material existence, and the wonder and awe prompted by it supply the content of Ammons's natural religion. By way of overflight, we're offered a radical new perspective on life, not a melancholy sense of pointlessness because of its brevity or insignificance, or an Arnoldian sigh that the natural sciences have eroded belief in eternal life with God, but the enjoyment of a ride on the Milky Way, which he calls our Ferris wheel, one that lasts as long as life allows. Our entire life is a life on the Ferris wheel, as he says. Although Ammons evokes contemplation several times in his poetry and in his reflections on it, the specific references are muted and passing, and at no stage does one find a moment when the poet's gaze achieves unity with the One, as St. John of the Cross does in Una Noche Oscura, for example. Ammons may be the poet of one-many problem, but not a poet of the one, or of simple vision. He looks back to Lucretius more surely than to Plotinus. Recall Guide, which you have a stanza from before you. How, I said, can I be glad and sad? But a man goes from one foot to the other. Wisdom, wisdom. To be glad and sad at once is also unity and death. Wisdom, wisdom. A peach blossom blooms on a particular tree on a particular day. Unity cannot do anything in particular. His concern is with finding wisdom, not truths of metaphysics. A wisdom that concurs with what he has learnt in his undergraduate study of the natural sciences, enhanced by his reading of American transcendentalism, and that helps him to live his life. We might say that Ammons is often to be prized as a poet of consideratione, which is traditionally placed somewhat lower in the hierarchy of spiritual exercises once they were adapted to Christian ends. And that is partly because he thinks in verse, as Harold Bloom rightly sees, and also because of the resonance of his single most powerful lyric, The City Limits of 1970, where the anaphora of Where You Consider is almost hypnotic. I'll quote the poem in full, which you have before you. I certainly need a sip of water to read this. When you consider the radiance, that it does not withhold itself, but pours its abundance without selection into every nook and cranny, not overhung or hidden. When you consider that birds' bones make no awful noise against the light, but lie low in the light as in a high testimony. When you consider the radiance, that it will look into the guiltiest swervings of the weaving heart and bear itself upon them, not flinching into disguise or darkening. When you consider the abundance of such resource as illuminates the glow-blue bodies and gold-schemed wings of flies swarming the dumped guts of a natural slaughter or the coil of shit, and in no way winces from its storms of generosity. When you consider that air or vacuum, snow or shale, squid or wharf, rose or lichen, each is accepted into as much light as it will take. Then the heart moves roomier, the man stands and looks about, the leaf does not increase itself above the grass, and the dark work of the deepest cells is of a tune with May bushes, and fear, lit by the breath of such, calmly turns to praise. Now, Bloom reads this lyric as profoundly Emersonian and hence romantic in the American tradition, a reading I find cogent and convincing. Here as elsewhere in Ammons, one cannot put aside the sage of Concord's impressive sentence, I become a transparent eyeball, I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. This passivity before nature in all its diverse abundance, which opens the soul, is as close as one reaches in Ammons to a contemplative stance. It's Emersonian, not Plotinian, and not Christian. The poet's gaze is anterior to the poem, and the poem itself actively thinks as it proceeds, and so is not entirely given over to being receptive. The City Limits does not lead to absorption into the one then, but to a discerning admiration for the generosity and persistence of the radiance of natural life, despite the resistance it meets on our planet, and to the ways in which the one becomes the many. The title itself alludes to a passage in Sherman Paul's Emerson's Angle of Vision, in which Emerson is taken, I quote Sherman Paul, to have two perspectives on nature, distant and proximate, which correspond to the country and the city. Distant vision tends to equalize phenomena and is associated with democracy, while proximate vision leads one to distinguish, analyze, and dissociate phenomena before it. Ammons's lyric is set at the city limits, where hierarchy begins to give way to equality. It's a poem of simultaneous double vision. We see the radiance over everything, and we also see the particulars of shale, squid, lichen, and so on. Yet the line I'm following perhaps opens another way of regarding the poem, one that does not diminish the reading proposed by Ammons's first and finest critic. In the 10th canto of the Paradiso, Dante encounters Richard of St. Victor, who is introduced as Richard, who in consideration was more than man. Consideratione most likely originates in Roman augury, perhaps deriving from the Latin Sidus Sida, star constellation, but became firmly grounded in monastic spirituality with Bernard of Clairvaux's De Consideratione. There we find that this exercise has a threefold value. It's an examination of how best to apply sense and sensible realities for the common good. It prompts intellectual exploration of a topic, and it seeks a speculative apperception of the truth. Long before Ammons uses the word, though, the specifically Christian associations of consider have almost wholly dissolved in the air. We hear them in the Archbishop of Canterbury's speech in Shakespeare's Henry V. At that very moment, consideration like an angel came. By the time we get to Juan de Valde's unorthodox 110 Considerations, 1638, translated by Nicholas Ferrer and annotated by George Herbert, we're among the last embers of the religious practice of consideratione in English. Nonetheless, the word consider is the backbone of a spiritual exercise that the City Limits performs in its own way. We're enjoined to consider the radiance, to recognize that it pours over the world without discrimination, that the light testifies to the radiance in its mode of physical manifestation, that it enters human psychology with all of its defense mechanisms and disordered or conflicted desires, and confirms what it encounters without moral judgment. Nor does the radiance of life shy away from disease and waste. Everything is offered to the effulgence to the extent that it can accept it. If we bow to the principle of life given in the present moment, notice that the poem does not speak of remembering or anticipating, then we are led to welcome our place in the cosmos, the activities of our cells, whether their programming leads to a long life or a short one, a happy one or an unhappy one. Our response to the extent and generosity of life, if properly considered, will not be neutral, nor will it be ecstatic. Consideration, and it's an American inflection, with twofold vision of proximity and distance, calmly turns to praise. The calmness and the praise are equally weighted in the context of fear, both indices of an achieved toughness and an achieved wisdom. Well, I go on to say a lot more, but I'm not going to say it tonight. That's more than enough literary criticism for one evening. Thank you.
One of the things that we've done is we've asked the keynote speakers to respond to each other initially. So Amoria, who's come to us from Nashville, Tennessee, and you'll hear more about her tomorrow morning when she gives her keynote, but she's going to respond to Kevin.
Yes.
Thanks, Amoria.
Hello. I'll save my longer thanks for tomorrow, but yeah, just very glad to be here, and the jet lag is getting to me, so I'll hopefully not fall asleep. Yes, so thank you very much for your essay. I just have some brief response. Okay. In his essay, Poetry as Spiritual Exercise on A.R.Ammons, Kevin Hart offers a careful meditation on the convergence between the practice of poetry, its emergence through the ambiguous relationship of writing and reading, and spiritual exercise. Against both an overdetermined conception of poetry, which might lean too heavily on the author or the reader, and against a conception of spiritual exercise that would result in a checklist of practices one should participate in order to produce a particular set of emotions, Hart considers how reading Ammons' experimentations in writing poetry might be read as spiritual exercises, while also acknowledging the kind of ambiguities or difficulties that emerge in such a view. An interesting aspect for me in this essay is the relationship between form and exercise, as it appears not only in Ammons' own poetry and growing discontent with poetic forms, but in Hart's meditation on Ammons' poetry, and the way Hart's approach to Ammons gestures at a kind of spiritual exercise too. Here, the form of the essay acts as a certain practice in attending to Ammons with a steadiness that refuses hasty reading. Writing with his own slanted prose, we might say that a sense of the poetic at work here is an exercise in the cultivation of a certain attention on the part of the reader or the audience. As a slow circling through Ammons' poetry, a careful guide to the shifts that emerge in Ammons' work as he plays with the assumed limits of practice in poetry, nature, and transcendence, Hart's reading here also enacts something of the sense that he points out to us. That is, the question of poetry as spiritual exercise is presented to us by Hart as a question of life that opens through a slant reading, as experiments in living within the creaturely finitude that characterizes existence. In this sense, the essay seems to turn on questions of ethics at a slant, which I wonder if Hart might take up more directly in the wake of this paper. What is the ethical injunction that this theological sense of poetry as a spiritual exercise communicates? How might the cultivation of attention be a passageway to considering, in the sense that Hart alludes to, the difficulty that is present in the limits of language? The impossibility or possibility of language being adequate to life, and the attempt through poetry as a spiritual exercise to do justice to something that has been felt or witnessed to. And how does the at times incongruent relationship between the theological reader and the secular poet also gesture to certain limits of language and difficulties between the two? A question I've been concerned with as of late is how different kinds of writing practices reproduce certain kinds of reading communities. And there seems to be a generativity that Hart locates in the secular poet that enables a line of questioning which is foreclosed by devotional poetry or other kinds of poetry that is explicitly religious. And I wonder then what reading community Ammons' work brings into being and what reading community is imagined on the other side of this essay for Dr. Hart. And what is the relationship between the recommendation for life and the imagination of an audience, even if the practice of writing takes place as a personal exercise? As I was reading this essay, I was reminded of a poem by Adrian Rich, What Kind of Times Are These? After noting a place between two stands of trees, Rich leads the reader into shadows near a meeting house abandoned by the persecuted, who disappeared into those shadows. Linking the disappearance in the shadows with the darkness of the woods, Rich ties together attending to nature and attending to the disappearance of people and places that mark life under particular formations of capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy. Rich ends the poem by saying, she won't tell you where the place is, and yet she still wants to do some telling. She closes, and I won't tell you where it is, so why do I tell you anything? Because you still listen. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees. The poem closes with the sense that the telling about the trees and the disappearance of people and places and telling about that in poetry are related. Talking about the trees, about nature, can be obfuscating as much as revealing. And I read this poem here because I'm interested in how the natural seems to pretend a particular kind of relationship in Ammons that's quite common or easy to think with in American naturalist poets, things about immanence and some kind of universal human experiences of nature and the world. But I also wonder, how does the comfort with this kind of natural religion depend on the cultivation of perception that forecloses or disappears other kinds of attention? And under what conditions is such attention to the natural formed and shaped? And what's disappeared by these various practices of attention? What kind of reading community do our considerations make present? And in what sense does the timeless or universal tint to these poetic images betray the difficult disappearances that are also part of the ethics that poetry as spiritual exercise might demand if it takes such questions of the now into account? Thank you.